Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 8th chapter in the book of Matthew. We're going to begin with the 18th verse and take it all the way to the end of the chapter. But before we do that, we just want to review what occurs in the book of Matthew, beginning in the first chapter. The first 17 verses gives a genealogy of the Messiah's descent from Abraham and David, thus fulfilling the Abrahamic promise and the Davidic covenant. And then we read of the miraculous virgin birth all the way till the end of the first chapter. Then in the second chapter, we meet the Magi, who were Persian astrologers who were privy to the fact of the chosen one's birth, and they traveled a great distance to meet him, bestowing upon his family gifts. Then Herod learns, they visit Herod and ask him, "Where is the King of Jews?" And he says, "What King of Jews?" So this gets him very nervous. And so he orders the execution of all the 2-year-olds in the town of Bethlehem. That's where the prophet Micah predicted he would be born. Consulting his religious authorities, they locate Bethlehem, and then they slaughter all the innocent infants under the age of 2. And Joseph, the Messiah's stepfather, is warned of an angel of this event in a dream, so he flees with his family all the way to Egypt. Then in the third chapter, some 30 years later, that's when John the Baptist, his biological cousin, burst on the scene. He's the one who came to pave the path and point the way to the Messiah, and he baptizes others, and not only others, but the Messiah himself. John initially resists and protests, saying, I have need to be baptized by you. But the Messiah quashes his question with the statement, it must be done to fulfill all righteousness. Then at that glorious moment in time, we read of the Father's voice in heaven, the Spirit visiting upon him. The Father's voice of approval in heaven, the Spirit descends in the form of a dove. So at that moment, we read that all three members of the Trinity are present. And then the Spirit leads him in the wilderness to be tempted, and the baptism marks the inauguration of his mortal ministry. He spends 40 days fasting, and that's when he's most vulnerable. That's when Satan offers him 3 temptations, each of which are repelled by a citation from the book of Deuteronomy. And then we read that he calls his disciples, many of whom were fishers, he calls them to be fishers of men. Then in the 5th through 7th chapter, we read of the Sermon of the Mount, which is the longest recorded sermon in the Old or New Testament. And the 5th chapter opens with the Beatitudes, which are paradoxes, which kind of reverse the expectation of certain qualities. Then he explains his relationship to the law, beginning in the 17th verse, and he says that he did not come to abolish, but to fulfill the law. And he raises the bar exponentially on the Mosaic law. He actually makes it a more lofty demand. Rather than focusing on actions, he focuses on the attitudes, which are the root of the action. So just for one example, lusting after a woman with one's eyes is the moral equivalent of adultery. Then in the 38th through the 48th verse, he gives what can be described as the most difficult commandments: to love thy enemy, for example, and to be perfect as your Father in heaven is imperfect. Then in the 6th chapter, we witness him denouncing the hypocritical practice of certain spiritual disciplines, almsgiving, fasting, and prayer, which are supposed to be selfless deeds, but can be rendered selfish if done for the sake of publicity or to be noticed. He also gives what is known as the Lord's Prayer in the 9th through 13th verse. Then he explains on the kingdom priorities all the way to the end of the 6th chapter, which closes with do not worry about these things. Seek ye first the kingdom of Elohim, and all these carnal desires and necessities will be provided for you, but have your priorities in order. Then in the 7th chapter, the first 5 verses, he gives an explanation of judgment, warning that those who judge and condemned will be judged and condemned in proportion and in the manner which they have judged and condemned others. Then he gives the golden rule in the 12th verse, whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them, for this is the prophet, the law and the writings. And then he kind of explains the narrow path, the straight and narrow path to salvation, broad is the way of destruction. And he warns that many who preach and prophesy and perform miracles in his name will be rejected at the judgment, because they did it with a false sincerity. And he will say, "Depart from me, you workers of iniquity, I never knew ye." Then he was teaching them, the 29th and closing verse of the 7th chapter, he was teaching them with authority and not as the scribes. So the scribes taught with secondhand authority, but his authority came straight from heaven. Then in the 8th chapter, the one we find ourselves in, we witness him heal a leper. So his power over his sickness is clearly demonstrated. Then we read of in Capernaum, a Roman centurion comes and asks him to heal his servant, and he says that I am a man under authority. He recognizes that he has the authority to heal him from a distance. And the Messiah says, "Truly I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith. And I say to you that many shall come from the east and the west and sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, whereas many of the Jews would be rejected from that blessed abode." Even though in the 10th chapter, verses 5 and 6, he limits the apostles' ministry to the confines of the promised land, he warns them not to go into Samaria, the seed for the eventual extension of the Gentiles, some of whom coexisted within the promised land, were firmly established. Then we witness that he heals Peter's mother-in-law. So once again, he demonstrates his powerness over all ills, and he heals all the demon-possessed, cast out the spirit with the word, and healed all those who were sick. We witness him in the passage we're going to cover towards the tail end. He heals with the word a man who is possessed, two men who are possessed by demons, and this fulfills the writing of the prophet Isaiah. He himself took our weaknesses and bore our sicknesses. That's the 17th verse. The 18th one is the one we're going to open on, and it reads, "And yet when Yahweh saw large crowds about him, he gave a command to go off to the other side." So he had a magnetic attraction. He had no trouble attracting mass audiences, but he wasn't in the business of building quantity disciples. He wanted quality, and much of the demands he imposes on two would-be disciples demonstrate what he's all about. So he had to get away from the crowd, and nevertheless, certain people follow him, would-be disciples, who are told the price of discipleship. So they had a mistaken illusion about what being a follower would be entailing. It demands the full surrender of all other priorities under the preeminent priority of following him. "And a certain scribe, having come near, and said to him, Teacher, I shall follow you wherever you go." So a scribe would have been the one who would have been a writer of the law, and they were closely connected. Many scribes were Pharisees, many Pharisees were scribes, and this one, unlike most of them, expresses an interest in joining him. But the Messiah tells him in verse 20, "And Yahshua said to him, The foxes have holes, and the birds of the heavens nest, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." So he was an itinerant, wandering, technically homeless preacher. He did not offer or lead a life of comfort, but a life of difficulty. But he did show the way and pave the path. The demands of discipleship and the path thereof are wrought with difficulty and struggle. And so he just wants to, and now the Son of Man is a messianic title. We read of it in Daniel 7:13. This is the first time we read of it in the book of Matthew, the Son of Man. "And another of his disciples said to him, Master, first let me go and bury my father. But Yahshua said to him, Follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead." So at surface value, this seems to be a violation of the fifth commandment to respect thy parents, but it is also more at surface value. But when we analyze and dig deeper, we read that it is it's the principle of the first commandment to give God the preeminent concern and priority. So let the dead bury their dead. Come follow me. Waste no time. Do not be concerned with what task you have left unattended to in the previous life. You are called to a newness of life, and that's going to take you away from your old priorities. And when he entered into a boat, his disciples followed him. This would have been the Sea of Galilee, the region of Galilee, which was to the north of Samaria, which was to the north of Judea, would have been his base of ministerial operations, and his disciples are following him. These are the ones who were deemed worthy and knew the price of discipleship, and they followed him willingly. And see, a great gale arose on the sea, so that the boat was covered by the waves, but he was sleeping. So we witness a clear-cut contrast between the chaos of the sky and the sea, and he is sleeping peacefully. Now, he knew that this storm would come, but he permitted it to come to demonstrate to the disciples in company with him, in the boat with him, a lesson about faith and fear. And the disciples came to him and woke him up, saying, "Master, save us, we are perishing." So this was an intense storm. Their very boat was rocking. Their very lives were threatened and in danger because they were at the mercy of the elements. But as we read, the elements are at the mercy of Yahshua. He has as much command and control over them as the leprosy, the demon-possessed, and every sickness and ail. He just says a word, and his command and control is demonstrated by that word. That's all it takes to establish his dominance and superiority over the elements of nature, which can kill and render one sick or injured. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid, O you of little faith?" Then having risen, he rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. Now in the other synoptics, we read that he raises his hands and say, "Peace, be still." But here, the dialogue, he says, we're not privy to what he rebuked the winds or what he said. The only thing we do know is that, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" Those two words, afraid and faith. Fear and faith cannot no more than any man can serve two masters. Matthew 6:24, Luke 16:13. Can faith and fear simultaneously reside in the same vessel at the same time? So we can either be fearful or faithful. We cannot be both. And the disciples were walking by sight, and they were fearful, but they had enough faith to call on the master when he was sleeping to alert him. They didn't know, they thought they were goners, but they summoned him, and he rebuked the winds and the sea, and what was once chaos was a great calm. It was as if it was suddenly. So what was once the lightning was flashing, the sea, the waves were roaring, but suddenly they are replaced by a calm and peace. And then the man marveled, saying, "What is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" So they had not yet come to the realization of who he is. What manner of man is this, is how it's more familiar translated. So that question, what type of person or who he is, forms in the 16th chapter we read that he asked the disciples, "Who do others say that I am?" And then he asked them, "Who do you say that I am?" They had not yet come to the realization that he was divinity in the flesh, the word incarnate, but it's Peter who comes to the correct confession in the 16th chapter, "Thou art the Son of the living Elohim." But none of them knew at this time. There was a lot of mystery entailing who he was. They knew he was extraordinary. They knew he was superior in power to the elements and the illnesses, yet they did not yet grasp that he was divinity in the flesh. And when they came to the other side, to the country of Girgashite, two demon-possessed ones met him, coming out of the tombs, very fierce, so that no one was able to pass that way. So we read similar accounts, the same sequence of the chaotic storm that is calmed by his word in the fourth chapter of Mark, which bleeds into the fifth chapter. This is the scene. And in Luke's 8th chapter, we read of the same sequence of events. But what's different in Matthew's account is there are two demon-possessed men, and the Girgashites would have been, this would have been on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. That's the other side of the Galilee. And the precise location in Matthew's account is, I think, 6 miles southeast of the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee was some 13 miles in length and 8 miles in width. But the Mark in Luke's location is located some 35 miles. This is not a contradiction. This is not this does not in any way invalidate the inerrancy of Scripture. They're just there happened to be two at this occasion, and they were coming out of the tombs. Now the demon-possessed gravitate towards the dead and we were all dead in sins and trespasses before we became born again. They were very fierce. There were violence. This is one of the characteristics of demons. Violence and mental derangement are symptoms of demonic possession, and there was no one could restrain them. No one could control them. But the Messiah got to the root of the problem. He knew that it wasn't the men, but the demons in the men that was causing this disturbance and this problem. And see, they cried out, saying, "What have we to do with you, Yahshua, son of Elohim? Have you come here to torture us before the appointed time?" So the question they ask is something we must all ask ourselves. What have I to do with thee? The rich man says, I don't need the good news. That's for the poor man. The intellectual says it's for the uneducated, and the common man says he can't understand it. The radical says it's not revolutionary enough. But let me tell you something. Every single one of us has something to do with him. And if you don't have something to do with him in this lifetime, you're going to have something to do with him in the next time, because there's coming a day when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is master and Elohim and Savior. So you may not bow your knee down to him today, but there's coming a day when you will be forced to bow your knee, and that day when we must stand and be reckoned before him. And the other item I want to comment on is the appointed time. The demons know that their destiny is doomed. They're doomed to hell, and this is an appointed time. Read of somewhere in the book of Revelation, the 20th chapter, that Satan and his minions are cast into the lake of fire, where they join the anti-Messiah and the false prophets. So they're tortured by his presence because they are in the midst of a superior power. The demons are not atheists. They're not agnostic. They are orthodox. They are fundamentalists. They do not struggle in believing in divinity, and in fact, they tremble before him. So they recognize... And at a distance from them, there was a herd of many pigs feeding. So they are technically in Galilee, but it is Gentile territory. Remember, it's to the east of the Sea of Galilee, which may or may not have formed the western extremity of the Promised Land. So in any case, they are in Gentile territory because pigs were unclean animals by the dietary restrictions of the Mosaic Law. And the demons begged him, saying, "If you cast us out, send us into the herds of pigs." How awful must hell be that the demons prefer to live in the pigs and live like a pig. And once the demons enter into the pigs, they possess all the characteristics of demon possession, namely lack of self-control and sanity. So they eventually walk straight off a cliff and drown themselves. But the demons, once they're cast and expelled and no longer inhabit a person, in Luke 11 we read that they retreat to an arid desert location, and they will return with 7 demons to attack and possess the same person. So the exorcism is incomplete unless you make the most of it. And he said to them, "Go." And they came out and went into the herd of the pigs, and see, the entire herd of pigs rushed down the steep place into the sea and died in the water. So demon possession is characterized by a lack of sanity and self-control. So these pigs couldn't control themselves. They ventured all the way off the cliff, 2,000 of them. And in Mark's account, at least, we read that there was a legion of demons, which would have been anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000 of them. So that averages to about 2 a pig, because there's 2,000 pigs in Mark's account. So 3 demons apiece is more than enough to possess them to walk straight off the cliff to their own destruction, demise, and death. And the herdsmen fled and went away into the city and reported all this about those possessed by demons. So the herdsman would have been the one who owned and purchased these pigs, and they're not too happy to lose their financial predicament. They are unconcerned with spiritual transformation. Here were two men who were controlled and owned by demon possession. No one knew quite what to do with them. They couldn't. He broke out of prison, and he dwelled among the dead in the graveyard in the cemetery. But these men were worldly minded and financially motivated. Their chief concern was financial, and they were indifferent to the spiritual transformation. All they could think about was their self. And see, all the city came out to meet Joshua, and when they saw him, they begged him to leave their borders. So they knew the man who had expelled the demons, the one who had performed the exorcism of two demon-possessed men, and they asked him to leave. They were seemingly unmindful of the spiritual transformation that he could offer a demon-possessed person. And in Matthew, Mark and Luke's account, which are more extensive than this, we can read of Matthew's in the first 20 verses of the 5th chapter. It's Luke 26 through 39. There's not quite as much commentary and details in Matthew's version, but we read that the recently liberated man asked to be his disciple, and he sends him to his home and his family to tell what great deeds he has done. But the city wanted nothing to do with him because he had upset their commerce, so they had their priorities all out of whack. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Take care until then. Bye-bye.